tuck your knees up. That's what Shirley heard her skydiving instructor screaming right into her ear as they plummeted toward the earth, both of them fully aware that the next second would be their last. Shirley Dygart was a first-time skydiver, a grandmother who never in a million years imagined herself standing 13,000 feet up in the sky about to jump out of a plane. This wasn't even her idea. It had all started when her son, celebrating his 30th birthday, begged her to join him for the jump, painting it as this ultimate mother-son bonding experience. So she figured, hell, YOLO, let's be adventurous for once. And without overthinking it too much, she told her son, you know what? Why not? Let's do it. Setting a motion of chain of events that would eventually change everything. And this is how they ended up at Skydive Houston in Waller County, Texas on a sweltering August afternoon in 2009. Standing together in a parking lot surrounded by her husband, her excited son, and her 3 grandkids, Shirley awkwardly adjusted her nylon harness over her clothes while trying to convince herself that this was going to be fun, despite the knot of fear growing in her stomach. Her instructor was a man named David Hartstock, and honestly, David was the perfect person to calm her down because this guy had over 800 jumps under his belt, 5 solid years in the sport, and every certification you could possibly earn as a skydiving instructor. He had done this so many times that strapping up a nervous first-timer and walking them through the initial jump was basically second nature to him by this point. He already completed 6 jumps that morning alone, so he honestly felt ready to just call it a day and go home. But when someone at the drop zone asked if he could just take one more student before he left, David said, okay, yeah, sure, one more jump, that's easy. And unknowingly, that jump turned out to be Shirley. Standing out in the runway before the flight even took off, David could immediately tell that Shirley was really nervous, beyond belief. But I mean, can you guys even blame her? She was as stiff as a board, her smile was a little too forced, and her eyes kept drifting up toward the plane with this haunted look, like she was seriously reconsidering every single decision that led up to this moment. So David leaned in with that easy, reassuring grin on his face, and he said, look, don't worry, you're strapped to me, and I'm not about to let anything happen to myself. It was one of those corny little lines that he used on every nervous student who crossed his path. It was honestly like clockwork, and it worked every single time. Shirley busted out laughing, her shoulders finally dropped as the fear loosened his grip, and together they climbed into the small, loud Twin Otter aircraft waiting on the runway, ready to take the skies. At 13,000 feet, the door of the plane slid open and the wind came rushing in, and she watched anxiously as her son shuffled toward the edge of the aircraft, and right before he jumped into the void, she screamed out, "Have a good jump!" And then her son disappeared into the rushing wind, tumbling out the door. One by one, the other jumpers followed, vanishing into the blue, and suddenly it was her and David left in the plane. David checked the harness one last time, pulling on each strap to make sure that everything was secure and tapping his ripcord out of the pure muscle memory of hundreds of jumps. And then he signaled to Shirley that the moment had arrived. They waddled awkwardly to the open door together, the wind howling around them, Shirley's feet right at the very edge, and she practically gasped when she looked down and saw the entire state of Texas laid out below her like a map. David gave her a quick squeeze of reassurance and said, "You ready?" And Shirley, absolutely terrified out of her mind, took a long, shaky inhale, and then she nodded yes. 1, 2, 3, jump! They tumbled out into the open sky and the earth rushing up toward them at over 120 miles per hour in that incredible free fall rush. And for about 30 seconds, everything felt absolutely perfect, like pure magic just unfolding in front of them. It was utterly surreal, and Shirley relaxed into it completely as waves of dopamine coursed through her body, washing away the last remnants of fear and leaving her with this exhilarated feeling that she had never known. David guided them through these gentle 360 turns so that Shirley could take in this breathtaking view of patchwork fields, winding roads, the distant towns stretching out below them, and the whole thing just felt magical and safe and completely controlled. Like David had done this thousands of times and nothing in the world could go wrong. Then David glanced at his altimeter and it read 5,000 feet, which meant that it was time to deploy the parachute and bring them back to a gently gentler descent. And so he reached back confidently and pulled the ripcord the same way he pulled it hundreds of times before, fully expecting to feel that familiar hard deceleration as the canopy filled with air and slowed their fall. But instead, he felt a violent snapping jerk that rattled through their bodies. And then he heard a sound that made his stomach drop straight to the floor. A loud, sharp pop, like fabric ripping under impossible strain. And before either of them could even process what that ominous noise meant, the earth below them started spinning wildly around their vision. The main chute had tangled in its own lines and failed to open the way it was supposed to. Instead, it was now just a useless, flapping sail that only dragged their bodies into this vicious downward spiral known in skydiving as the death spin. And that name, as David knew all too well from his years of experience, was not some dramatic nickname. It was exactly what it sounded like. Guaranteed death. Scared completely out of her mind, Shirley started screaming in this raw confusion and sheer terror, her voice piercing through the wind as David fought with everything he had to stay calm and regain some semblance of control over their plummeting bodies. But the spinning was so brutal and relentless that David could feel the edges of his vision going gray, a sign that he was on the verge of blacking out from the forces ripping through his body. And he knew that if he lost consciousness for even a moment, there would be no one left to pull the reserve parachute, and they would slam straight into the ground at over 100 miles per hour with zero chance of walking away. And so, still wildly spinning out of control with the altimeter ticking down mercilessly on his wrist, David desperately reached for his emergency knife to try and cut away the tangled main chute. He had to do this first. Otherwise, when he pulled the reserve, it would just get swallowed up into the same knotted mess. But as he tried to pull it free, he discovered that the knife was hopelessly tangled in the cords of the malfunctioning parachute itself. And now, no matter how hard he clawed at it and strained at it with everything he had, he simply could not get it loose. And in that moment, he remembered that mounted right in front of Shirley was a second emergency knife for this kind of situation. So he stretched his arms forward to try to grab it, but they were spinning so violently and so unpredictably that he couldn't reach for that one either. The force of the spin actively worked against every single move he tried to make, while the altimeter was just ticking down and down, 4,000 feet, 3,000 feet, and the ground kept rushing up to meet them. So running completely out of options and time, David grabbed the reserve ripcord with a white-knuckled grip and yanked it hard. It was risky, he knew it was risky, but he was praying to God that the backup parachute wouldn't get tangled with the main one that was already an absolute knotted disaster above them. And for a brief, beautiful moment, it actually seemed like it was going to work, because they had stopped spinning and they slowed down just enough to feel like maybe, just maybe, they were actually gonna survive this thing. But then the worst thing that could have happened. The main parachute, which had been nothing but a useless tangle of fabric and cords just moments before, suddenly caught a gust of full air and fully opened. Now they had two parachutes deployed at the same time, and this created a horrifying scenario where both parachutes were pulling them completely opposite directions. Their bodies were being dragged violently left and right through the sky as they descended full speed towards the ground. And within seconds, David and Shirley could feel their heads rotating downward, pointing straight at the earth. This was worse than before, and David knew it immediately, because the position they were in is now called a down plane. They were now diving headfirst towards the ground at full speed. And if their chances of surviving were almost zero before, they had just become something that doesn't even have a number. David, seeing just how close they were to the ground now, about 2,000 feet and closing in fast, he pulled on every available line in the parachute with the very last bit of strength that he had left in his body. And somehow, he managed to pull them out of that nosedive. But then David does something that honestly made me emotional when I found out about it. And I say a little emotional, but I was quite literally bawling my eyes out. After pulling them out of that nosedive, David looked down and realized that they were about 1,500 feet from the ground. And with no more time, no more moves, no more options, they were about to crash, and there was no other outcome left. As he stared down at certain death rushing up to meet them, his mind flashed not to his own life or his own regrets, but to Shirley's son standing somewhere far below, watching this unfold in helpless terror, to her devoted husband waiting anxiously on the ground, and to her 3 innocent grandchildren who had come out here expecting a full day of cheers and excitement with absolutely no idea as to what they were about to witness. And he just couldn't bear the thought of them having to witness Shirley losing her life right before their eyes. So as they dove closer and closer to the ground, David made a decision. If they were both going to die anyways, why not give Shirley the highest possible chance of surviving? So in a final desperate act of heroism, he rotated his body along with Shirley's body with everything that he could muster, so that now he is underneath her and Shirley was on top of him. His plan was that when they hit the ground, since he was at the bottom, he would be the one to absorb the full force of the hit. And that's when he screamed at the top of his lungs over the roar of the wind, "Tuck your knees up!" Shirley, confused beyond words, sobbing uncontrollably and utterly terrified out of her wits, listened to exactly what he said without question or hesitation. She tucked her knees up tight against her chest, just as David instructed, completely unaware that what he was doing was sacrificing his own body to shield hers from the catastrophic collision they're about to have with Earth. And then just seconds after, they hit the ground with this bone-rattling crash that echoed through the field, a sound so loud it could be heard from a quarter mile away. Shirley's family came sprinting over in total panic, faces pale and eyes wide, because they knew just from that noise alone that this was bad. This was really bad. The kind of bad that people won't just get up from. And what they found when they reached the crash site were 2 bodies tangled in nylon, limbs twisted unnaturally, and David and Shirley looking completely gone. But then one of the bodies started moving. It was faint, barely there, but moving. It was Shirley, still breathing, but they had to act fast. Paramedics rushed both of them to the hospital, and Shirley had multiple fractured vertebrae and internal injuries, but she miraculously survived, and her injuries, though severe, were nowhere near as bad as David's. 3 days after the crash, Shirley and her family received devastating news. David had died from his injuries. But then hours later, another call came in. David was alive, but he was paralyzed from the neck down. He had died 3 times while doctors desperately tried to bring him to life, and each time they somehow managed to. When Shirley had finally recovered enough to visit him, she walked into that ICU and saw David in his wheelchair, his body still, tubes and wires running everywhere, and they just fell into tears. And she walked up and wrapped his arms around him and whispered, "I love you, Dave." And to this day, they remain friends. Wow, guys. Okay, I needed a story with a happy ending, but why am I still crying? When push comes to shove, I genuinely hope that you have a Dave in your life. I love you guys. I will see you in my next video. Mwah. Group hug.